Chapter 3, Christmas 1837. London 2017, a few days before Christmas. Under the hypnotic trance, Victoria had just said that her memory went back to Christmas 1837, while Dr. Mary on her face reflected mixed emotions and even her hands trembled. She urged Victoria to continue her story. Buckingham Palace 1837, Christmas Eve. Victoria was elegantly dressed in a red dress, and her maid Nancy had spent a couple of hours preparing her to look as beautiful and dazzling as possible. Victoria was nervous, and as excited and anxious as a little girl because that really was her at that moment, because she was a girl over 18 years of age who until then had not lived a real Christmas, and that's why her emotion was almost equal to that of a little girl who lived her first Christmas after ceasing to be a baby and had reached the age of reason to speak and understand what was happening around her. She almost wanted to go down the stairs quickly and run down the long, wide corridors and halls of the palace, and jump around, sending the devil the composure that was to be expected of a British queen, but cannot to do it. She settled for smile widely and laugh with any excuse. But Victoria was also a young woman who had not yet finished adolescence, and as such her heart beat with the longings and desires of a young girl who woke up to sexuality and longed for love. Perhaps Victoria did not understand her own feelings very well, although a suspicion lodged in her consciousness, like a small voice still remote and weak that tried to be heard. But what was evident was the emotion she felt whenever she was next to him, or when she simply awaited his arrival. And on that day Victoria was particularly anxious, waiting for her beloved Lord M to arrive, and every time a guest came to the door of the room, Victoria's heart would speed up and her eyes would search for him avidly. Until finally he arrived. Lord Melbourne walked towards her, awesome in his tall stature, dressed as the most elegant and impeccable of all the gentlemen she had ever known. He walked firmly, exuding virility, with one of his famous lovely smiles on his face, and with the seductive look of his eyes fixed on her. Victoria felt a slight tremor in her body. Victoria extended her arm and Lord Melbourne gently kissed the back of her hand, and then he straightened the body to meet her eyes. "Lord M, I'm glad you arrived. Fortunately we have your pleasant presence," Victoria said, trying to sound formal, but with a childish joy that could barely conceal. "For nothing in the world I would stop attending, ma'am. I would not miss the opportunity to share a Christmas with you, Your Majesty," Lord Melbourne answered in such a charming way that it almost seemed like he was flirting with her, making Victoria blush and go back to feel a tremor in her body. After a while Victoria, Lord Melbourne, and the rest of the guests went to the dining room and sat down to enjoy the abundant and appetizing dinner. In the 6 months that Victoria had been queen, she did not remember a dinner as happy and wonderful as that night, although in those months she had had the opportunity to enjoy many official banquets at the court. She felt that the atmosphere in general was charming and exciting, and that everyone seemed imbued with the festive spirit of that magical, ancestral, and mystical celebration. Or maybe it was just that whenever the looks of Victoria and Lord Melbourne crossed each other, whenever he gave her one of his wonderful smiles, or whenever he spoke to tell her some anecdote, comment something, or make some joke, she felt happy as a child when opening her Christmas presents. As dinner drew to an end, Victoria watched enthralled through the windows that it snowed copiously, and almost began to scream like a child of emotion. So Victoria hastened the end of dinner, to the dismay of some diners who still had not finished their meal. Victoria stood up, and barely complied with the formality dictated by the protocol. She walked away from the huge banquet table and soon the diners followed her. Victoria did not take her eyes off the huge windows and saw the snow falling in rapture, with how much desire she would have gone outside to play with the snow. Excited Victoria made her way through the light of the chandeliers, a light that gave a magical aspect to the palace room. But as Victoria was distracted and the guests were waiting for her, a voice called her. It was the voice of her faithful Baroness Lazen, her former governess, practically her adoptive mother, and now the head of the palace staff. Victoria realized her forgetfulness, and smiling was walking towards in the direction of Lazon to enter the room where she would preside over the dance with which she would regale the relatively small group of guests who had attended the Christmas Eve dinner. A few minutes later, Victoria searched with her eyes anxiously at Lord Melbourne, who had fallen behind talking to another gentleman when they left the banquet table. It was not long before he appeared and addressed her. "Did you like your first Christmas Eve dinner as Queen, ma'am?" Lord Melbourne asked with affection and joy. "Yes, Lord Melbourne. It was definitely more cheerful than my Christmas Eve dinners in Kensington. Although I did not know most of the diners well, I felt very happy, the atmosphere was very lively," Victoria replied happily. "I am very happy to hear it, ma'am. Evidently dinner would have been even happier for you if you had been surrounded by people of your age, young people, and not by many old people like us," Lord Melbourne said mockingly. "Lord M, when you're going to stop talking nonsense? You're not old at all, you're young and funny," Victoria exclaimed with a small laugh, and she blushed again because she was about to be indiscreet because she thought to say handsome and at the last moment she replaced it with funny. "Well, ma'am, you flatter me. Would you allow me the first dance?" Lord Melbourne replied with a smile. "Of course. Lord M," Victoria answered and mentally hoped not to have sounded too enthusiastic. Both went to the center of the room, where the crowd was waiting to start the dance, and both joining their hands began to dance when they heard the first chords of the music played by a small orchestra. Victoria felt herself levitating in the strong arms of Lord Melbourne as they both turned around the room, to the music. She felt that his hand almost at the end of her back burned her, as if it transmitted an intense hot that spread through her body and caused her to tingle. Victoria experienced for the first time sensations that she had never felt before and that she could not identify at all. "Ma'am?" Lord Melbourne asked. "What? Excuse me, did you say something, Lord M?" Victoria said that she realized that she was so enraptured, so absorbed by the emotion of dancing in his arms that night, that she had not realized that he was talking to her. "Yes. I just told you that this Christmas party reminds me a bit of the ones my mother organized. Of course them was a little less sumptuous because we did not live in a royal palace, but even if it was not Her Majesty's court, them were definitely parties very lively and charming," commented Lord Melbourne with nostalgia and joy. "Really? Did your mother really liked Christmas?" asked Victoria, interested and cheerful. "My mother liked any occasion to be happy, any occasion to unite the family and make all her children happy. She was a very vital and cheerful woman, and loved the festivities. I think that deep down she always had certain soul of child, even when she was older and her death was near. That's why she put so much care into making Christmas at Brocket Hall so special, that each inhabitant of the house felt touched for the spirit of the festivity. And that is why she planned every detail of the Christmas feast with much anticipation. Yes, definitely when I was a boy, Christmas was very special for me thanks to my mother," Lord Melbourne answered with a sweet smile. "It was the kind of Christmas that I would have liked to have," Victoria replied with some sadness. "Well, ma'am, not everything was perfect. My father," said Lord Melbourne, getting a little serious and sad to remember the man who had officially been his father, the husband of his mother. Although everyone assumed that he was the son of one of the lovers from his mother, he was a man, bitter, and his mood was not exactly improved by his excessive love of alcohol. "So, even though my mother tried hard that him not to ruin our Christmas, sometimes he could get it, even if it was half," he added, and his face was covered with the pain that caused him the memory of some Christmas in which his father had been hard on him, making him the victim of some humiliating rebuff. Victoria saw him with compassion and wanted to stop the dance and draw his head to her chest to comfort him, but it was an impossible desire. "You had your father, and I had Conroy. I do not know which one would be worse," Victoria said with a mocking and ironic smile, which made Lord Melbourne and she ended up laughing. "Maybe you and me are more alike than people can imagine, maybe we are soulmates," added Victoria, seeing him with a look full of tenderness and affection. Lord Melbourne shuddered when he saw the look in Victoria's eyes, he felt his heart speed up and that a small tremor ran through his body. He felt the danger lurking, because he had never felt this way, so vulnerable to the charm and beauty of a woman, even when he was a teenage boy who fell in love for the first time, and not even when he met his wife Caroline, despite that with her had been love at first sight. Lord Melbourne had to make an effort to calm down and not look so disturbed. Well, the only advantage to stop being children, and to become adults, is that we can decide how to celebrate Christmas. And I am sure that from now on all your Christmas will be happy, ma'am, because you can decide how and with who you celebrate them, and I wish that your life is very long so that it can compensate the sad moments of the past, said Lord Melbourne in a charming way. Thank you very much, Lord M. I also wish all the happiness for you, at Christmas and at any time. Victoria exclaimed happily. Victoria and Lord Melbourne continued to dance enchanted, then she danced with a couple of diners, and then she went back to dancing with him. At one point Lord Melbourne caught her attention and took her to a corner of the room. Ma'am, I think I should advise you to prepare yourself for a surprise, Lord Melbourne said with a mischievous smile and gesture. A surprise? Exclaimed Victoria, intrigued and excited. Yes, that's right, what would Christmas be without surprises, ma'am? He replied delighted. Before Victoria could say anything else, she noticed that the little orchestra was leaving the room with its instruments in the direction of another room, and then Baroness Lazen approached Victoria and asked her to go to that room. Victoria saw Lazen and Lord Melbourne with curiosity, and then she jolly walked towards the stage, and the guests followed her. In the other room there was a group of chairs arranged in such a way that it resembled the stalls of a small theatre. Victoria sat on the seat of honor, and then the others took a seat next to and behind her, and Lord Melbourne sat with Emma and Emma's husband sitting between him and Victoria. The orchestra settled into another group of chairs in a corner. Expectant Victoria waited for the surprise, until they began to hear voices, a chorus of voices that seemed to approach Victoria and the rest of the audience, while the orchestra began to play. Them were childish and very tuned voices, a lady of medium height, thin and very white skin, quite pale, entered followed by a group of little girls dressed in red and gold robes, while the girls enthusiastically sang the lyrics of the song. I saw 3 ships come sailing in. On Christmas Day, on Christmas Day. I saw 3 ships. It was the lyrics of a popular Christmas carol, I saw 3 ships. Victoria was very happy and moved. She did not stop smiling as some tears ran down her cheeks, and a couple of times she turned to see Lord Melbourne which smiling happily. When the Christmas carol was over and the children's choir was silenced, the woman bowed deeply to Victoria and the girls behind her imitated her. Your Majesty, it is a great honor to be here today in front you and such a distinguished audience. I am Mrs. Julia Curran, and I am a teacher at the Coleman Institution, a school for poor and orphan girls. We have been distinguished with the honor of singing for you on this Christmas Eve, and that's what the Coleman Choir girls are here for. We hope that it is to your liking, and with your permission we want to offer you other Christmas carols from our repertoire, said Mrs. Julia in an excited voice. Victoria nodded delightedly, and then, under the guidance of Mrs. Julia, the girls' choir began to sing another carol. The first Noel the angel did say was to certain poor shepherds. At the end of the carol the first Noel, the girls sang the next, Come, thou long-expected Jesus. Come, thou long-expected Jesus. Born to set thy people free from our fears. The girls sang other carols, and at the end Victoria stood up and greeted the girls, one by one, with much affection, tenderness, and joy. The girls were very excited and some of them could not help but shed a few tears for the thrill of being in front of the Queen. Victoria congratulated them with enthusiasm and thanked them for their wonderful voices. A while later Victoria was talking to Mrs. Julia and Lord Melbourne in a corner, while the girls had been taken to an adjoining room where Lazen had arranged for them to have cakes and various sweets for them. So, when Lord Melbourne gently invited us to sing in front you, Your Majesty, we was deeply honored and grateful to Lord Melbourne for giving us this opportunity to share the talent of our girls. The Lamb family is very generous to us, Your Majesty. Lord Melbourne's sister, Lady Emily, is one of our greatest sponsors for a long time, and tonight's invitation is a wonderful gift for our girls in the midst of the hard lives they've had, something that surely they will never forget, said Mrs. Julia with joy and gratitude. The gift has been mine. I can tell you, Mrs. Julia, that this has been the best gift of my life. Your girls have voices of true angels, and I have felt that they have transported me to that night when our Lord Jesus was born and that I have been by his side in the manger of Bethlehem. Believe me when I tell you that it was the best Christmas Eve of my life, and that's why I would like to do something for your girls, to improve their living conditions, Victoria responded, very moved and happy. All help is always grateful, Your Majesty. Although thanks to the generous donation that Lord Melbourne has made, I think that the situation of the girls will be much better in the short term, said Mrs. Julia, but seeing the face with embarrassing gesture of Lord Melbourne thought that perhaps she had been indiscreet. Yes. Lord Melbourne is very generous, Victoria said, funny but seeing Lord Melbourne as if she were proud of him. A few minutes later Victoria and Lord Melbourne were talking to each other alone, both standing in the doorway of a room. Lord M, why do I suspect that the surprise for me came out very expensive to you? Victoria said with a charming smile. Well, ma'am, after all it was for a good cause. Helping those unfortunate girls, who have really had a hard life, is gratifying enough by itself, but if I can also make this Christmas one of happiest and most unforgettable in your life, any amount of money is nothing to put that smile on your face, ma'am, said Lord Melbourne with affection and charm. Lord Melbourne saw how Victoria's eyes shone, the look on her face, and thought maybe he had talked too much. And besides, after all I am a widower without children to whom I can leave my inheritance, and my sister and my brother already have enough money to live without problems the rest of their lives. So, well, I can afford to be a little wasteful, ma'am, said Lord Melbourne, funny and trying to sound joking, although a little embarrassed. Well, Lord M, things can always change, Victoria replied, looking at him with an intense and almost suggestive look, which betrayed the deep feelings of the innocent Victoria, making Lord Melbourne nervous while his heart accelerated. Lord Melbourne tried to distract Victoria with a talk about other things, and she answered enthusiastically, until suddenly her eyes fixed on something that was on top of Lord Melbourne. Lord M, have you seen that? Victoria asked. Lord Melbourne followed Victoria's gaze and realized that half hidden among the garlands that hung from the threshold was a sprig of mistletoe. I imagine you know that widespread habit among the servants, Lord M, Victoria said with interest. Oh, yes, the habit of kiss each other under the mistletoe. I believe that when I was a child, they have already practiced it. I knew that the servants of Brocket Hall did it. I imagine that some mischievous servants placed it there to take advantage when the masters were not in sight to kiss the maids. Everyone has fun at Christmas, ma'am, replied Lord Melbourne, amused. Yes, everyone, but, in the end we always end up emulating the funny customs of the common people. And why not? Victoria said with longing, while blushing. Lord Melbourne was confused and needed a few moments to understand what she meant, but when he realized, his confusion turned into horror. The Queen wanted him to kiss her under the mistletoe. It was so inconceivable that for that reason in the first instance his mind resisted to understand it, although the sense of her words was evident. Distressed Lord Melbourne thought that the champagne glasses that Victoria had drunk had had an unwanted effect on the inexperienced and naive young girl. He also cursed himself because perhaps he had sent confusing signals to the girl, that Victoria's mind, aroused by alcohol, which she was not used to, had misinterpreted. Or was it his own wish that had betrayed him? Ma'am, that's something, it's simply unimaginable. It would be against any rule of respect and loyalty to the crown. It's absolutely impossible, answered Lord Melbourne seriously, very nervous and uncomfortable. Victoria's face darkened and she ducked her head in embarrassment, and when she picked her up again there were tears running down her cheeks and there was a lot of sadness in the look on her face. "Forgive me, Lord M. I'm a silly girl. I still do not know how to behave properly as a queen. Excuse my clumsy and shameful behavior," she said with pain. "No, ma'am, please. It's not that bad. It's just a protocol error, but I do not want to see you sad, because the purpose of tonight's celebration would be lost." Lord Melbourne replied, anguished and moved by her. But his words only made Victoria feel sadder and cry with a little pout. Lord Melbourne could not bear to see her like this, and he felt that he would not forgive himself if Christmas Eve ended like that for her, ruining her first happy Christmas in life. Touched and with love for her, Lord Melbourne saw all sides and realized that fortunately nobody saw them at that moment. He took a deep breath and decided. He quickly bowed his head and gave Victoria a quick kiss on the cheek. Victoria was surprised, with wide eyes and a comical expression on her face. Then she relaxed the gesture and finally her face was covered with infinite happiness, with the sweetest and most charming smile in the world. "It must be our secret, ma'am. I do not want to end up in the Tower of London for taking me liberties with the Queen," Lord Melbourne said, funny but nervous and embarrassed. "I swear, Lord M, they'll never know for me," exclaimed Victoria, very happy and excited. They both laughed. A few hours later Victoria was in her bed, dressed in her long nightgown and wrapped in sheets and a quilt, and Dash was lying next to her on the bed. Victoria caressed the cheek on which Lord Melbourne had kissed her, with a sweet and mischievous smile on her lips. "It has been the best Christmas of my life, Dashy. I wish all my Christmases of the rest of my life are like this. And hopefully Lord M will be in all of them," Victoria said excitedly to Dash, as if he could understand her. In the London of 2017, Victoria was awakened from the trance by Dr. Mary shortly after that last memory, with instructions to remember what she had seen in her regression, or at least partially. A few minutes later, a confused Victoria, almost stunned, was conversing with Dr. Mary, both sitting face to face with the doctor's desk between them. I do not understand. I have read somewhere that one of the best evidences that past lives and reincarnation are true is that the lives that all people remember are the lives of ordinary people. If people will remember that they were famous people, people like Napoleon or Cleopatra, that would be evidence that reincarnation is a myth, an absurd fantasy, and that the memories that take place under hypnosis would be simple creations of our imagination and what we know of history. However, I have remembered that I was nothing less than Queen Victoria. Is not that absurd?" Victoria said, her voice a little broken by the emotion of the vivid memories that were still in her memory, as if them were things that had just happened, and above all of the emotions she had revived. "What you say is true, at least in part, and of course it has logic, but you must consider something, Victoria. If all human beings reincarnate, why should famous people be an exception? After all, a famous actor, a great general, a memorable writer or a legendary queen are people of flesh and blood. They are human beings like the rest of human beings, and they do live the death trance like others, do they? Why should not they reincarnate like everyone else? It would be against the logic of the cosmos that a few people were deprived of reincarnation, while the rest of human beings enjoy it or suffer it, depending on the case. In addition, there have been a few documented cases of ordinary people who have remembered previous lives and who were at least famous artists. Your case is not as exceptional as you think," explained Mary in an affectionate and pedagogical way. "But still, I can hardly believe that I was the most famous queen that England had had other than Elizabeth I, but there are other things that I do not understand. Is not it supposed that when we reincarnate we change our physical appearance? From what I could see in the mirrors that I saw in my memories, my physical appearance was almost identical to what I currently have, except for the color of the eyes, because then my eyes were blue. Hell, if I had had to reincarnate, I could have been born taller," Victoria said, and saying her last words made the doctor let out a giggle. "But not only that, it is also assumed that in each life we should change the name. How do you explain that? Continue to call me Victoria. But also my husband appeared in my memories as Lord Melbourne, and he also had the same physical appearance, and he is also called William in this life. Victoria added, bewildered. Yes, I recognize that this is not typical, but think one thing, Victoria. Although it is true that all human beings have a common nature, in the great characters of history there must be something special, something exceptional and mysterious. Have you thought of how exceptional it was that Victoria was born into the royal family and destined to be queen? Why was she not born in any of the other tens of thousands of families that were in Britain in that time? It is something to think about. Destiny is very mysterious and God or the universe works in a curious way. So, if we do accept that something special and mysterious exists in the great characters of history, would it be unreasonable to think that they made an exception with you and your loved ones so that in this life everyone will keep their physical appearance and at least the same first name? Maybe it was necessary for them to have the opportunity to properly correct everything that was wrong in your previous life, or simply the universe was in debt to you and wanted to reward you for everything you could not have in your previous life, answered Dr. Mary. Yeah, I admit that that makes sense, but William, my husband, the man I love and I'm sure is my soulmate, if there are soulmates, he was Lord Melbourne in my memories of that alleged past life, is not he supposed would have been Prince Albert in my past life? Albert was supposed to be the great love in the life of Queen Victoria, as her soulmate. Well, at least that's what history says, Victoria replied. Victoria, do you think the official history always tells us the whole truth? Asked Dr. Mary with a sarcastic smile. Remember there was a time when they sold us that Prince Charles and Diana's relationship was a love story of fairy tales, she added. Touché. But then, that childhood infatuation of Victoria by Lord Melbourne on which historians have speculated was much bigger than we imagined, and if Lord Melbourne was the real man of her life, then her life with Albert would not be very happy. And assuming I was her, then, does this have anything to do with my current emotions? Victoria asked. It is most likely, but to know how this affects you now, to know what consequences it has had on your personality, the only way is to remember absolutely everything, remember that exact moment when your fears and your traumas were born. That is the essence of any therapy based on regression. We must go to the point of your existence in which those internal demons that now manifest in those nightmares and in that strange melancholy or depression that occurs especially at Christmas arose. In any case it is always useful to draw the appropriate lessons from your experiences in past lives, said Dr. Mary. Victoria thought for a moment. Does that mean more hypnosis sessions? Victoria asked. Yes, Mary answered kindly. All right. I'm curious to know what happened. It's a more intense experience than what I experienced when I jumped parachute, and I recognize that for a long time something so exciting has not happened to me, not even the birth of my last child has been so exciting, said Victoria with a slightly ironic smile. Seem right, but you must remember that the purpose of this is therapeutic. We seek to improve your emotional balance and to be happier. On the other hand, I would advise you not to tell everything to your husband until we have advanced more in the therapy, and we will have managed to remember the fundamental moments in the origin of your current emotions. I think in a couple of sessions you can have a more complete picture, and then you can talk to your husband with more information, Mary replied. Well, I do not like to hide things from my husband, but I think it's reasonable what you say. I imagine we should schedule the next session, said Victoria. That's right, Mary replied. After leaving the doctor's office, Nancy saw Victoria with mocking and curious expression. And so? Nancy asked in a funny tone. If you want me to say that you were right, you win. It was very intense and exciting, Victoria replied, still a bit dazed. Upon arriving home, Victoria felt strange and excited to be reunited with her family and husband, with the vivid memories of her past life, fresh in her memory. When she opened the door, her husband came to meet her. William was dressed in jeans and a long-sleeved shirt, that he wore with sleeves rolled up. But when he approached her, Victoria had a flashback and saw him dressed as Lord Melbourne, in a dark suit from that era of 1837. And it was as if Victoria was transported that time of Christmas party of 180 years ago. And she instinctively extended her right arm with the back of her hand upward, so that William/Lord Melbourne will kissed her hand. William was surprised. Note: the custom of kissing under the mistletoe was born among the servants in the England of the late 18th century, and was prolonged and popularised by the servitude of the Victorian era, when it gradually spread to the other social classes.